The news coming out of Ukraine is not good for Russia. 10,741 visually confirmed losses of pieces of heavy equipment, 2,054 of which are tanks either destroyed, abandoned, or captured. Estimates without visual confirmation place it around 3,000. Over half of its Ka-52 attack helicopter fleet destroyed, with 5 in 1 week during the June Ukrainian counteroffensive alone. Documents revealed by the infamous Discord leak show that the Department of Defense estimates Russia has suffered between 189,500 to 223,000 casualties, with between 35,500 to 43,000 killed in action. And that was before the Ukrainian counteroffensive began, with fierce fighting across the northern front. Alleged HIMARS strikes were especially devastating, with one strike in mid-June that allegedly killed dozens of Russian soldiers waiting to hear their commander speak. That information has yet to be verified, however. As its offensive began, Ukraine enacted a media blackout across its front, ceding the propaganda war to Russia for several weeks. However, when the lights came back on to the world, they saw a steady stream of Russian POWs being marched away from the front. The Russian lines aren't crumbling, but they are breaking. And Ukraine is yet to put the full might of its reserve Western-trained firepower into the fight. So, why can't Russia field better troops and equipment? Better is a relative term when Russia is concerned, especially when talking about its troops. Historically, Russian troops have severely underperformed against any international grading system. While in exercises like its famous Zapad combined arms exercise, Russia got to LARP as a professional Western military. The truth is that when put to the test, Russian soldiers fail. In the First Chechen War, the massive Russian army was roundly defeated by Chechen rebels. Russia's initial force of 23,800 faced off against an estimated 1,000-strong rebel army, increasing to 6,000 after a year of fighting. Despite this, Russia suffered a whopping 14,000 killed or missing and 52,000 wounded. Estimates on the Chechen side place military losses at 3,000 dead. Even Russia's elite paratroopers, worshipped as demigods in Russian society, thoroughly embarrassed themselves, such is the infamous case when a 50-strong assault force landed behind enemy lines and was promptly taken captive, forcing the Russian military to fly helicopters overhead, blasting out a warning that if they weren't released, the Russian Air Force would destroy several villages nearby. The Second Chechen War wouldn't go much better, though Russia managed to subdue the region by backing pro-Russian Chechen warlords. In both cases, however, Russian military failures were so significant that they were forced to rely on brute force alone to subdue the region. In the now infamous bombings of Grozny and other Chechen cities, the Russian military leveraged the only real advantage it had: superior firepower. Through an extensive bombing and artillery campaign, Chechnya was reduced to rubble, with civilian casualties estimated to be as high as 100,000. When your troops are hot garbage, it helps if you have the world's largest artillery corps. The real question is, why are Russian troops so bad, and can they get any better? Russia's woes as always go back to its extreme corruption. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia has struggled to field a Western-style professional military and has relied overwhelmingly on conscription. Before the Ukraine conflict, it had made significant strides toward that goal, with an estimated 3/4 of its armed forces being professional volunteer soldiers. The service length for conscripts was also dropped from 24 months to 12 months, which after training and orientation only gave Russia about 5 months of use from each batch of conscripts. However, tellingly, conscripts still made up 1/3 of Russia's combat armed forces, including its elite Spetsnaz units, something which is unthinkable in the US military. The difference between conscripts and volunteers is significant, with volunteer soldiers having greater morale and proficiency than conscripts. Typically, a volunteer soldier chooses to serve and is more motivated to do so than a conscript forced to serve. However, volunteer soldiers are also serving for longer terms, allowing their military to get more combat-ready time out of them in relation to the length of their training, and to build a greater degree of proficiency and thus lethality over time. Professional volunteers also form the backbone of the military itself, moving up the ranks and increasing in knowledge and expertise, making them and their organization more efficient. Once a conscript's term is up, they are offered service contracts, but the vast majority choose to immediately leave, taking their talent, millions of rubles in training costs, and expertise with them. And speaking of backbones, Russia's military has none. Not just in that it's a cowardly army incapable of standing up to a peer adversary and forced to try to bomb civilians instead, but as it lacks the basic building block of a professional Western-style military: volunteers who re-enlist, advance in rank, making up the non-commissioned officer corps that's so integral to the success of a modern military. These are the senior enlisted men whose jobs it is to oversee the day-to-day operation of the military, everything from enforcing training standards to direct battlefield leadership. Instead of an NCO corps, Russia just makes junior and warrant officers take up those roles, much to its detriment. These are typically men and women who have had higher academic training and are thus more valuable and more rare, and better suited for the challenges of higher leadership positions than watching over a squad of conscripts. This forces Russia to overwork its officers, placing significant stresses on them and inevitably leading to the deferment of authority and leadership to senior conscripts or low-ranking recruits. And this is not a modern problem either. As noted during the Cold War, Soviet units were typically run by second-year conscripts, with what few NCOs the Soviet Union did have deferring to them in most matters. For any of our viewers who have ever served in the military, you can well imagine what a nightmare scenario it would be to have E2s and E3s in charge of running day-to-day operations. You can probably also imagine just how well those operations were managed, let alone actual battlefield actions. NCOs are responsible for making sure that orders from the top are followed through, and we have plenty of evidence from the Ukrainian conflict that this is not always being followed through or done so poorly thanks to the lack of a solid leadership structure amongst Russian units. However, Russia's lack of NCOs also directly contributes to its biggest problem in attracting and keeping talented recruits: hazing. It's called the rule of the grandfathers, and it's a nightmare of hazing that would make any college frat initiation ritual look like a pleasant walk in the park. The secret to Russian military hazing is that it never stops. It just perpetually flows downhill, even from the highest echelons of military power. Older conscripts brutalize those younger than them, with what few NCOs exist brutalizing the senior conscripts, while officers do the same to their NCOs. Beatings, humiliation, torture, even forced labor and sexual assault. There are a wide range of reports from Russian leaders simply renting their troops to local villages to use for hard labor. Meanwhile, older recruits and conscripts commit outright sexual assault on younger conscripts and force them to beg their families for money so they can steal it. Officers, meanwhile, look the other way, mostly because they're engaged in different forms of hazing themselves, albeit at a more subtle level. Hazing is nothing new in the Russian armed forces. It's a pass-me-down from the Soviet times. Hazing, however, is pure poison to a military, as it destroys unit cohesiveness and retention. In his memoir, Kirill Podrabinik wrote in 1970 that if his unit was thrust into combat, half of the unit might shoot the other half. There have been no documented cases of this happening, but there are plenty of cases of murder spurred on by hazing in the Russian armed forces. But where it really hurts a military is in the ability to retain talent. Even with significant incentives, only 1% of Soviet conscripts re-enlisted with the army, and that figure has not improved much. Especially because after the fall of the Soviet Union, the situation got even worse. Political officers were removed from military units, taking away one major source of discipline in the Red Army. The entire military received a significant reduction in pay, prompting junior officers to steal equipment or from their own troops, or to be too preoccupied with a second job to pay much attention to the discipline of their unit. In 2002, the BBC published a report where senior Russian soldiers were selling those junior to them into prostitution rings. As the Russian economy recovered, hazing seems to have improved somewhat, but it's impossible to know given how tight-lipped Russia is. A law passed by Vladimir Putin in 2015 made military fatalities suffered in peacetime a state secret, in effect making it impossible to calculate how many conscripts or recruits were being killed or committed suicide due to hazing. A key aspect of a modern military are ready reserves. The U.S. military fields reserves for all of its branches except the Space Force, and these reserves were of critical importance during the dual wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Good reserve systems allow a military to retain a large pool of proficient soldiers that it can call upon in case of a war, long after they've been separated from the military. With monthly training capped by a larger evolution once a year, reservists maintain proficiency in their respective career fields while living a civilian life. This allows a nation to double or more its standing forces with proficient soldiers in case of war, rather than bloat it with freshly conscripted soldiers with no training or expertise. Russia, however, lacks a modern reserve system. In 2008, the nation launched a massive reform aimed at creating a professional NCO corps and a reserve system. Both goals have failed. Instead, Russia's focused on improving its air and rocket forces, though you really wouldn't know it by looking at the performance of the Russian aerospace forces in Ukraine, which has been abysmal. Despite having nearly 1 million people with previous service time to call upon, this pool of Russian personnel only served their single one-year term and have limited military proficiency. Meanwhile, less than 10% of this potential reserve force receives any kind of refresher training. And training might be Russia's biggest problem, because it simply doesn't do much of it. Russian military culture has a tradition of what's known as picture reports. Whereas a Western military would file a report on the results of training, with updated goals and frequent inspections, the Russian military simply marches its troops to a firing range, has them fire off 1 or 2 shots, takes a picture, and calls it a day. The photo report serves its purpose. It establishes that on the required day, said unit was in fact at the range shooting their allotment of ammunition to maintain proficiency. In reality, officers simply take the budget given to them for training and split it amongst themselves. The same goes for soldiers' actual pay. A Russian unit commander is responsible for receiving and disseminating his soldiers' pay. Naturally, said commander skims a percentage off the top for himself first. This system also incentivizes commanders to overstate their unit numbers. Despite not being at full strength, a commander will report all billets filed so he can receive pay allotted to soldiers who don't exist. Meanwhile, when senior Russian officers make battlefield decisions on what units to deploy where, they do so not realizing that those units may be significantly under strength. This culture is not an accident, however. Rather, it's part of the social contract that Russia's culture of corruption has established with all branches of its government and military. You're free to be corrupt as long as you largely do as you're told and help push the messages Putin's propaganda is disseminating. The only time Russia cares about corruption is when it gets in the way of state goals. Even now, with the Russian military in a catastrophic state, Vladimir Putin is helpless to enact the anti-corruption measures drastically needed to turn things around. Because if he were to do so, he would face mass revolt from the higher echelons of the military and the government. But Russia's training problems have become acute, and now the nation faces a true crisis just when it needs its well-trained troops the most. As the war in Ukraine entered its 6-month mark, Russian losses were so severe that it was being forced to reach deep for additional personnel. This is when Russia made a move that baffled Western observers. It began to pull instructors away from its training bases and put them on the front lines. These senior soldiers might have been better trained and more proficient than the losses they were replacing, but by removing this experienced training staff, Russia was ensuring that follow-on reinforcements would not receive the benefit of their lessons and experience. Instead, Russia was forced to install junior training staff with predictably poor results. Russia has officially entered what is known in the West as a military death spiral. This is when a military's best and most proficient soldiers, a term we use very loosely when talking about Russia, are killed or wounded and then replaced with reinforcements that are less trained and proficient, and are subsequently decimated. Their replacements are now even worse prepared for combat, and on in a death spiral that eats militaries alive. This death spiral is evident across the Ukrainian front, with Russia suffering significant casualties even in what is essentially an offensive that's currently made up of light reconnaissance and force attacks. Ukraine has yet to commit significant combat power to the offensive in a breakthrough operation, and across the entire front, Russian troops are losing ground. The losses may only be measured in hundreds of meters, but the fact that they are being pushed back nearly everywhere is a sign of how poorly the Russians are performing. This death spiral is most evident in Russia's aerospace forces, though. Russian pilots are already poorly trained by Western standards, with their American counterparts having 4 times or more flight hours by the time they graduate to their assigned airframe. When it comes to providing close air support, an element of battle badly needed by Russian troops on the front, Russia's disadvantages are even more significant, with only a fraction of its pilots trained in this role. Famously, during one of the recent incursions into the Belgorod region by Russian partisans, a Russian fighter pilot attempted to bomb partisan forces and missed by an embarrassingly wide margin. Russia has lost 425 aircraft so far in the war in Ukraine, and its Ka-52 attack helicopter fleet has been decimated, with over half of it being destroyed. These losses mean not just the loss of airframes costing tens of millions of rubles, but often their pilots as well, and they're just as hard to replace for a beleaguered Russia. The nation has now been forced to move senior flight instructors to frontline duty, and thanks to a specific Russian doctrine of assigning the most dangerous operations to the most senior pilots, this has resulted in many of them getting killed as well. Now Russian aerospace forces are in significant danger of having a severe training deficit. While this won't mean an end to the war today, as the war evolves, Russia's airborne advantage is certain to break. A sign of desperation can be seen in the way Russia has sent its remaining Ka-52s into the frontline fighting in recent weeks. Despite staggering casualties in the first year of the war, Russia has sent its attack helicopters to stop Ukrainian thrusts in sheer desperation, resulting in 5 Ka-52s confirmed destroyed in less than a week of fighting. These are completely unsustainable losses, and Russia's aviation is rapidly approaching the point of a critical failure. And that brings us to Russia's other biggest problem. Why can't it replace its combat losses with better equipment? For at least a year, the world has joked about Russia sending in its ancient T-54s and T-55s after stripping them out of museums. Yet as summer began, that's exactly what happened, with visual confirmation of these ancient early Cold War tanks being shipped into Ukraine. As it claimed about its old T-62s, Russia said these vehicles would serve as static fortresses and provide long-range fire support. Naturally, this was a lie, and T-55s were confirmed destroyed in combat by Ukraine. Estimates vary, but Russia's believed to be able to produce about 60 tanks a month. But these estimates are muddied by a lack of independent data and the fact that Russia's tank plants both build new tanks and refurbish old ones, without specifically stating the difference. Thus, it's impossible to know if these 60 or so tanks a month are brand new or mostly refurbished Cold War relics. What is known is that Russia loses on average 150 tanks a month, meaning it's not even replacing half of its combat losses. And what it is replacing, it's not doing with very good equipment. At the end of the day, a tank is still a significant threat if you don't have something to deal with it. A T-55 might be a joke, but it's significantly less funny if you're an infantryman without a tank support of your own or an anti-tank guided missile. Luckily, with Western donations of both tanks and ATGMs, Ukraine has both. Not in numbers to match Russia, but enough to achieve a level of battlefield parity due to one big difference between Ukraine and Russia's tanks: technology. Russia's biggest problem in replacing any hardware is the extreme sanctions levied against it by the world. Russia is now the most sanctioned state in history, and these sanctions have effectively eviscerated the Russian defense industry. While the nation builds its own tanks, armored vehicles, aircraft, and missiles, all of these rely on electronics and components made in the West or abroad. Before the war, nearly all optics going to Russian tanks came from the West, and over half the microchips needed in its weapons as well. Ball bearings, which are of critical importance to modern equipment, are difficult to manufacture with a high degree of proficiency, and Russia imported most of those from the West. Now it's forced to alternatives that are of lower quality. But alternatives for other tech simply aren't widely available. Microchips, for example, are of critical importance, and Russia has been forced to rely on lower-quality Chinese chips as well as those it can smuggle in via alternative means. Russia is quite adept at sanctions busting, but while it's impossible to completely stop Russia from getting Western technology, shutting off the tap means what tech it does get is limited in quantity and much more expensive than it would be on the global market. This limits Russia physically and financially, and leads to things such as Russia's new T-80s and T-92s rolling off production lines having gunner sights rather than the sophisticated optics and fire computers. With Ukraine getting access to more and more modern Western armored vehicles, what vehicles Russia can replace on the front are simply no match. This leaves Russia to rely on its artillery advantage, but even that has significantly lessened due to a shortage of ammunition. While Russia initially enjoyed a 20-to-1 advantage in artillery, combat losses to precision Western systems and a global shortage of ammo has led to that advantage dropping to as little as 6-to-1. To make matters worse, domestically produced ammunition has been found to be of low quality, with thousands of artillery rounds in one shipment declared unfit for use after a series of accidents. Russia's ability to resupply itself is dwindling with every passing month, and thanks to targeted sanctions, the prognosis is not good. The final hope Russia has is for China to finally agree to providing lethal military aid, a move that will draw international condemnation against the Chinese, and possibly even its own sanctions. President Xi Jinping has proven hesitant to cross this red line drawn by the US, but he also has little interest in seeing Russia fail and left weakened, a broken husk that could collapse into a civil war at any time. In order to keep the US on its toes and with its attention split between Asia and Europe, China needs Russia to remain a credible threat to Europe. In time, Xi might have no choice but to let the tanks roll for Russia, expanding the conflict. But until such a time, Russia's only real advantage over Ukraine is the sheer size of its army, and the Russians' own incredible appetite for casualties. Having suffered horrifically one-sided losses that would have resulted in mass protests in Western nations, Russia appears to remain politically stable, with little sign of the general Russian populace getting ready to rise up and depose Putin. Now for a laugh, check out everything going wrong for Russia in the war against Ukraine, or click this other video instead.